Jonathan Marshall's world was built on precision. Every decision calculated, every move deliberate. From the outside, Marshall Technologies stood as a beacon of success, an empire that seemed invincible. But as the news anchor's voice pierced the silence of his high-rise office, everything began to crack. Breaking news. Major scandal at Marshall Technologies. Reports of espionage and betrayal within the company. CEO Jonathan Marshall under investigation for illegal activities. Jonathan's heart pounded as the words echoed in his mind. Betrayal. His empire, founded on years of trust and ruthless strategy, was crumbling. Sarah Whitaker, his longtime advisor, entered the room, her face pale. Her words, though calculated, carried the weight of uncertainty. "John, it's happening. We need to act fast." He clenched his fists, anger flooding his veins. How could this happen? How could someone close to him betray the very foundation of their success? The TV screen flickered, displaying images of his company's logo, now tainted with scandal. His mind raced. Who could it be? Who had he trusted enough to allow them access to his deepest secrets? The very idea of betrayal stung like an open wound. He had to move, had to act. But one question gnawed at him. How much of his empire would he lose before the truth surfaced? His eyes darted to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The once beautiful city skyline now looked like a distant, cold reality. Jonathan's thoughts raced as he stood in front of his desk, holding the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm for someone in the midst of a scandal. "You need to come to the boardroom immediately," Edward Crane, his trusted advisor, said. "There's something you don't know." Jonathan's mind went blank. How could this get worse? Edward was the last person he expected to deliver more bad news. Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone as the weight of the situation began to sink in. What could possibly be worse than the media storm that was already raging? He wanted answers, not cryptic messages. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," he replied, his voice steady but betraying the storm of emotions building inside him. He hung up, turning to face the empty room. The city skyline outside had once symbolized his success, but now it seemed to mock him. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the company, waiting for him to make the next move. Was this the beginning of the end? As Jonathan walked toward the boardroom, each step felt heavier than the last. The sense of urgency was palpable, yet his mind was clouded by doubt. The sleek hallways of his empire, once symbols of triumph, now seemed sterile and cold. Entering the boardroom, Jonathan was met with the harsh stares of his executive team. Edward Crane stood at the head of the table, his face unreadable. The others remained silent, exchanging nervous glances. "John, we need to talk," Edward said, his tone lower than usual. Jonathan's pulse quickened. "About what?" he asked, his voice betraying a fraction of the tension he felt. Edward gestured to the large screen on the wall, which displayed a series of encrypted files, each labeled with his name. "We've found something disturbing," Edward continued, scrolling through the files. Jonathan's heart sank. The files, while familiar, carried information he never authorized to be shared. His empire was now being dissected, piece by piece, and he had no idea who was pulling the strings. "Who did this?" Jonathan demanded. But no one spoke, the silence thick and suffocating. The realization hit him like a truck. Someone had been working against him from the inside. Someone close. The stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. Jonathan's gaze moved from Edward to the files on the screen, his mind scrambling to piece together the puzzle. Who could have done this? The files detailed internal transactions, secretive meetings and plans Jonathan never approved. "This can't be real," Jonathan muttered, his voice low as if trying to convince himself. Edward nodded, his face darkening. "It's real, John. Someone inside the company has been feeding this information to the enemy. The question is, who?" Jonathan felt the weight of betrayal settle in his chest. This was not just a corporate issue anymore. It was personal. Someone close to him had orchestrated this entire scheme. He stared at the screen in disbelief, the stark realization dawning on him. Was it Sarah? Edward? Or someone else he had trusted with everything. The thought that someone within his inner circle could be responsible was almost too much to bear. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I want names," Jonathan snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. "Now." As the team exchanged wary glances, the room grew even more tense. Every second felt like a countdown, and Jonathan knew that time was running out to stop the conspiracy before it destroyed everything he had worked for. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping the surface, each beat echoing in the tense silence. He had to make a choice, and he knew it couldn't be delayed any longer. The conspiracy was now clear, and he had no idea how deep it ran. "If we don't act fast, we'll lose everything," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Jonathan's eyes met hers, and for the first time he noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer the calm, supportive advisor he had known for years. There was something different in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. "We need to find the mole and cut them off. Now," Sarah continued, her voice steady but sharp. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Agreed, but we do it my way." He stood up, pacing around the room, his thoughts racing. The stakes were higher than ever. "We go after the source of the leak first," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "If we can stop the flow of information, we can control the narrative." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one challenged him. Jonathan had always been the leader, and he knew that if he didn't act decisively, he would lose everything. But in the back of his mind, the nagging question remained: was Sarah truly on his side? Or was she just another player in a much larger game? Jonathan's office door slammed shut behind him. Sarah was waiting, her expression grim. She slid a thin envelope across the desk. "This was left anonymously on my desk this morning," she said, her voice tight. Jonathan opened it, revealing photocopied internal memos, plans for a hostile takeover. His own signature was forged at the bottom of each page. His pulse quickened, heat rising in his chest. "Whoever did this knows our internal processes," he muttered. Sarah's eyes searched his face. "And they want the board to believe it's you." The air between them was charged with tension. Jonathan gripped the papers so tightly, they crumpled. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low but cutting. Every forged detail was a weapon aimed at him, crafted by someone with intimate access. He pushed the papers back across the desk. "Get me the originals. I don't care how," he said. Sarah nodded, but her hesitation didn't escape him. He couldn't tell if she was rattled by the discovery, or by something she wasn't saying. An encrypted email arrived in Jonathan's personal inbox at 3:14 a.m. The subject line read, "You're not looking in the right place." He stared at it, weighing whether to open it. With one click, a single line of text appeared on the screen: "Your mole is closer than your shadow." Attached was grainy CCTV footage, a figure in a hoodie slipping into the executive archive room at midnight. The image was blurry, but the way the intruder moved was oddly familiar. Jonathan leaned back, his stomach knotting. This was no random leak. It was calculated, personal. He forwarded the email to Edward with a terse note. "Find out who." Then he deleted it from his inbox. The fewer traces left, the better. But the words burned into his mind. "Closer than your shadow." It meant the enemy was inside his trusted circle, watching every move. Jonathan strode into Edward Crane's office without knocking. The older man looked up from a stack of documents, his expression calm but guarded. "You've seen the footage?" Jonathan demanded. Edward nodded slowly. "Yes, and I've run preliminary facial recognition. The results are troubling." He slid a printed report across the desk. Jonathan scanned the page. The name was one he never expected. A key member of his executive team. "That's impossible," Jonathan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Edward's eyes didn't waver. "John, the footage doesn't lie." Jonathan paced the room, the walls seeming to close in. Every step was heavier, the betrayal cutting deeper. "We keep this between us," he finally said, his voice low. "If the board finds out before we're ready, it's over." Edward gave a curt nod, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation Jonathan couldn't ignore. Jonathan was halfway down the marble corridor when his phone buzzed. Sarah's voice came through, urgent. "We have a bigger problem. Someone's leaking real-time data from the server room." He stopped in his tracks. "How do you know?" "Because I just got a call from the manipulative rival himself, Victor Kane. He knows about the documents before we've even moved them." Jonathan's chest tightened. Victor Kane was ruthless, and if he already had the intel, they were bleeding information faster than they could contain it. "Lock down the servers," Jonathan ordered. "I'll handle Kane." Sarah hesitated before replying. "John, be careful. This isn't just about business anymore." The line went dead, leaving him in the cold silence of the hallway, every instinct screaming that the enemy was 2 steps ahead. Jonathan dialed Victor Kane, the rival CEO who thrived on hostile takeovers and corporate sabotage. The line clicked, and Victor's smooth, mocking voice filled his ear. "John, I hear you're having trust issues." Jonathan gritted his teeth. "Cut the games, Victor. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Victor replied. "Your empire, and I'll take it piece by piece." Jonathan's hand tightened around the phone. "If you think you can scare me—" "Oh, I don't need to scare you," Victor interrupted. "Your people are doing that for me." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jonathan staring at the phone. The weight of Victor's words sank in. His enemy wasn't just outside the gates, they were inside, tearing everything apart from within. Jonathan leaned over the table in the strategy room, his fingers tracing the edge of a blueprint for a fake acquisition. "This is bait," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah's brow furrowed. "You want to feed them false intel?" Jonathan's eyes were cold steel. "Exactly. If the leak is internal, they won't be able to resist passing it on." Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "And if this blows up in the media?" Jonathan didn't blink. "Then we know exactly who our mole is." Every detail of the plan was crafted to lure the traitor into making a mistake. It was risky, but the alternative was losing control entirely. He slid the document toward Sarah. "You handle distribution. Only a select few will see it. If it gets out, I'll know who touched it." The tension in the room was electric, the unspoken suspicion heavy in the air. Late that night, Jonathan moved silently through the executive archives, the hum of the servers the only sound. The fabricated acquisition files were in a sleek black folder, placed exactly where he knew the mole would look. Every step felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and the plan would collapse. He double-checked the placement, ensuring the folder sat slightly ajar, inviting curious eyes. As he turned to leave, his gaze lingered on the security camera in the corner. He wasn't just setting bait, he was recording the catch. By morning, Edward burst into Jonathan's office, his expression grim. "It's out," he said. Jonathan's stomach tightened. "How fast?" "Within 3 hours of planting it. Victor Kane's people are already asking questions." Jonathan allowed himself a tight, controlled smile. "Then we know who it is." Edward placed a printout on the desk. Security footage showing Sarah entering the archives after hours. The evidence was damning, but something about it gnawed at Jonathan. Was it too perfect? Could someone have framed her? The trap had worked, but perhaps too well. Jonathan called Sarah into the boardroom. She walked in, her posture stiff, eyes scanning the room. "What's this about?" she asked. Jonathan slid the footage toward her. Her face didn't change, but her jaw tightened. "You think I did this? I think you were in the archives the night the files leaked," Jonathan replied evenly. Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You think you know everything, John, but you don't. If you keep playing this game, you'll lose more than your company." The silence after her words was heavier than the evidence itself. That night, Jonathan reviewed the raw security footage. Frame by frame he saw the truth. The timestamp had been altered. The real intruder's face was briefly visible in a reflection. Edward Kane. Jonathan's pulse thundered. The betrayal was deeper than he imagined. Edward had played both sides, feeding Kane while steering Jonathan toward distrusting Sarah. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the enormity of the deception crashing over him. The mole wasn't just inside the circle, he had been leading it. Jonathan closed the office blinds, the city lights reduced to faint glows behind him. Across the desk, Sarah stood motionless. "Edward's the mole," Jonathan said, his voice razor sharp. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "You're sure?" "I saw him on the uncut footage," Jonathan replied. "We're not telling anyone until we have him cornered." Sarah crossed her arms, weighing his words. "If this goes wrong, you're handing him the company." Jonathan leaned forward. "If we do nothing, he takes it anyway." The silence between them was heavy, but their unspoken agreement was clear. This was war, and they were allies, for now. Jonathan's first move was subtle, freezing Edward's private accounts under the guise of a compliance review. Edward stormed into his office minutes later. "You've crossed a line, John." Jonathan didn't look up from the document he was signing. "Just following procedure." Edward leaned in, his tone dropping to a threat. "You're playing with fire." Jonathan finally looked up, a faint smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "Then let's see who burns first." The air between them was electric, two predators circling for dominance. That evening, Jonathan met with an old contact in a dimly lit bar, a retired corporate investigator named Miles Harlow. "I need a full background sweep on Edward Kane," Jonathan said quietly. Miles, a wiry man in his late 60s, with sharp eyes, leaned back, swirling his drink. "And if I find something that buries him?" Jonathan's gaze was unflinching. "Then I use it." Miles chuckled without humor. "Careful, John. Men like Crane don't just fall, they drag you with them." But he agreed, slipping a small encrypted drive across the table. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the office to find a fresh headline splashed across every business outlet. "Marshall Technologies under investigation for market manipulation." It was Kane's move, bold, time to shake investor confidence. Sarah burst into his office, phone in hand. "The stock is already sliding." Jonathan scanned the headline, his jaw tightening. "Kane's trying to force a fire sale," he said. "We need to make him think he's winning." It was dangerous, but giving Kane false confidence might buy them the time they needed. Late that night, Jonathan reviewed Miles' report. The file was a goldmine: offshore accounts, falsified travel records, and direct links between Edward and Victor Kane. Every page was another nail in Edward's coffin. Jonathan closed the folder slowly, feeling the tide shift. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't reacting, he was in control. He dialed Sarah. "It's time," he said. "Tomorrow, we end this." There was a pause before she replied. "Then, I hope you're ready for what happens next." The boardroom was packed, tension coiled in the air like a spring ready to snap. Jonathan entered with measured steps, dossier in hand. "We need to address the security breach," he began, his voice calm but edged with steel. Edward sat across the table, his expression unreadable. Jonathan slid the folder forward. "Huh? This contains proof of the leak, and where it leads." Murmurs rippled through the room. Edward leaned back, smiling faintly. "Are you accusing me, John?" Jonathan met his gaze. "I'm not accusing, I'm proving." The words landed like a hammer blow, and the atmosphere shifted. Every eye in the room flicked between them, sensing the fight about to ignite. Edward chuckled, the sound cold and calculated. "Interesting story, John, but you've always been dramatic." He pushed the folder back. "Fabricated evidence won't save you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps the board should review the bank transfers to Victor Kane's offshore accounts. All routed from yours." The room erupted in whispers. Edward's smile faltered for the first time. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his tone shifting to quiet fury. Jonathan leaned in, voice low. "On the contrary, I know exactly what I'm doing." Jonathan pressed a remote, and the wall screen lit up with side-by-side footage. Edward entering the archives, Kane receiving documents minutes later. Gasps filled the room. "This isn't speculation," Jonathan said. Edward's hand tightened on the armrest, knuckles white. One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Langley, spoke up. "Edward, this is damning. What do you have to say?" Edward's gaze darted around the room, searching for allies, and finding none. For the first time, the power was slipping from his grasp. Grace called for an emergency vote. All in favor of suspending Edward Crane pending investigation. Hands rose one by one. Edward's eyes burned into Jonathan, a silent promise of retaliation. The count was overwhelming. Grace's voice was firm. Motion passed. Edward stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "You think you've won, John? This isn't over." Jonathan didn't flinch. "No, Edward. It's just begun." The boardroom door closed behind him with a sharp click, sealing his exit and his downfall. As the boardroom emptied, Jonathan remained at the head of the table, hands resting on the cool surface. Sarah approached, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said. Jonathan exhaled slowly. For now. Outside, the city lights flickered to life as dusk settled. The war wasn't over. Kane was still out there, and Edward wouldn't go quietly. But for the first time in weeks, Jonathan felt the faintest flicker of control. He knew the battles ahead would be brutal, but he was ready. Jonathan woke to chaos. The financial news channels were flooded with reports of Marshall Technologies' stock plunging. Kane had unleashed a coordinated short-selling attack. Sarah burst into his office minutes later. "The market's bleeding, John. We've lost nearly 10% in an hour." Jonathan's jaw locked. "Pull the emergency buyback trigger," he ordered. Sarah hesitated. "That will drain reserves." "Better drained than gutted," he snapped. As she left, Jonathan stared out at the city below. Kane wasn't just trying to wound him, he was aiming to kill the company in one strike. Jonathan's private line rang. Victor Kane's smooth voice slid through. "You can stop the bleeding, John. Sell me the controlling stake, and I'll let you walk away intact." Jonathan's laugh was bitter. "You think I'd hand you my life's work?" Kane chuckled. "It's not yours much longer." Jonathan ended the call without another word, but Kane's arrogance only steeled his resolve. He was done playing defense. Sarah entered quietly, her expression different, softer, hesitant. "John, there's something you need to know." She placed a folder in front of him. Inside was a decades-old paternity test, linking Jonathan to a woman he barely remembered from his youth, and a daughter now grown. Sarah's voice lowered. "Kane knows. He's threatening to use this to force your resignation." Jonathan's heart pounded. The corporate war had just turned personal, and his hidden family was now a weapon in Kane's arsenal. Jonathan arranged a quiet meeting in a small cafe, away from the corporate chaos. The young woman who entered looked to be in her early 20s, with his same intense eyes. "I'm Emily," she said simply. The conversation was halting at first, both weighed down by years of absence. But when she spoke of Kane's people following her, Jonathan's protective instincts surged. "No one will touch you," he promised. In that moment, the battle for his company became a battle for family. That night, Jonathan stood in his office, Emily safe in a secure location, Sarah at his side. "Kane crossed a line," he said, voice low but dangerous. "Tomorrow we don't defend, we attack." Sarah's eyes met his, a flicker of grim satisfaction there. "Then let's make sure we finish him." The city lights outside glittered like a battlefield, and Jonathan knew the next move would decide everything. Jonathan stood over the conference table in the pre-dawn gloom, maps of shell companies and financial trails spread before him. Sarah entered, coffee in hand. "It's all set," she said quietly. He nodded. "We hit Kane and Crane at the same time. No warning, no chance to recover." Her eyes flicked over the plans, the gravity of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just a boardroom move. It was the final strike in a war that had blurred every moral line. Outside, the city was just beginning to stir, unaware that its corporate skyline was about to change forever. By mid-morning, the boardroom was full. Jonathan entered flanked by Sarah, carrying a flash drive. "Gentlemen, ladies, today's agenda has changed." He plugged the drive in, and the screens lit up with undeniable proof, linking Kane and Edward in a joint hostile takeover plot. Gasps and murmurs broke the air. Edward, seated at the far end, went pale. Kane, appearing via video conference, simply smirked, until Jonathan displayed the signed agreements between them, obtained through Miles Harlow's digging. The smirk vanished. Kane leaned toward the camera, voice calm but venomous. "Impressive, John. But I still have something you can't fight." Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew Kane was about to bring up Emily. Instead, Kane smiled. "Your daughter's safety depends on you walking away." The room froze. Sarah's hand subtly tapped her phone under the table, sending a prearranged signal. Jonathan's voice was ice. "She's safe, Kane, and you're done." For the first time, Kane's confidence wavered. Jonathan revealed the final document, a legal injunction freezing all of Kane's and Edward's assets tied to Marshall Technologies. Effective immediately, you have no access to this company, its accounts, or its resources. Edward stood, furious, but security was already at the door. Kane's feed cut abruptly, replaced by the company's logo. Jonathan turned to the board. "Gentlemen, ladies, the threat is over." It wasn't victory yet, but it was the kill shot they needed. Hours later, Jonathan stood alone in his office, the city glittering under the night sky. Emily called, her voice calm now. "It's over, isn't it?" He paused. "For now." Sarah entered quietly, placing a single glass of whiskey on his desk. "You kept your company," she said. Jonathan looked out at the skyline. "At a cost." The war was over, but the scars, personal and corporate, would never fully heal. He took the glass, the city lights reflecting in its amber depths, knowing the peace would never last.